We've been working on parking policies for a long time, and people say, why parking policies? What does that have to do with transportation? And of course, parking policies are this amazing nexus between land use and transportation. You can't really even decide which one it is because parking uses up huge amounts of land in cities. It's a big use of land that you're not using for other purposes. Parking requirements alter where development occurs and what kind of development occurs, so it impacts development patterns throughout the region here. And of course, parking prices impact how people choose to travel. So it's both on the land use side and the transportation side. It has huge impacts. And MTC has major goals about reducing greenhouse gases and affordable housing issues here, as well as a number of other performance issues, but those two from the state. And parking policies impact both of those areas very fundamentally. So we are venturing into that area with full knowledge that local jurisdictions decide on parking policies, but the impacts are regional. So we're trying to address it in a way that says what regional policies could be enacted that would be supportive of good local parking policies that could work with those in a positive way. And I also do want to emphasize, and sometimes this takes people a little thinking, but parking policies can really work well for businesses. This is not anti-car, this is not anti-business, this is trying to manage a scarce resource. And for a long time, people have treated parking, many of us probably grew up with lots of free parking and never thought twice about it. And now we're realizing that treating it as a free resource really doesn't work well for our own interests. It doesn't create vibrant communities, and it doesn't deal with the cost of the land. It's not anti-car, but it is trying to manage it and make sense of this resource that we have that serves our community interests.
So the first key issue is supply and demand in the Bay Area. Here, one of the first things we did was create a parking application for data collection to streamline that process from collecting data in the field to a database. This is a big effort of this project, and we want to continue these efforts because the first thing for parking policies is to understand the existing conditions. We did this for 25 cities around the Bay Area, and this is really to understand how supply and demand interact.
So we wanted to dig a little bit deeper on what MTC could do and what they have done to date and what their role has been in parking policy development.
A couple years ago, we were approached by the city about what was going to become the Go Berkeley program, and we were kind of skeptical, frankly. It's like, yeah, right, We, in the past, we thought this was an opportunity to jack up rates and restrict parking. And the mayor, has been a wonderful supporter in transit as well as pedestrian, but we were skeptical in that some folks in Berkeley historically thought if we had no parking downtown or reduce the parking, people will switch to transit, which is true. Some people will. But we have a lot of people, whether they're seniors, people living up the hills with poor transit, or people from the Berkeley Rep, for example, they come from the South Bay, Marin, et cetera, and not everybody's can take transit. So we were thrilled and delighted when we started working with the Go Berkeley team that it was about value pricing and rationing and allocating a scarce resource. And we were delighted to meet Professor Shoup, who came in to brief the team, and we worked with the other merchants groups. But I think probably the things that were most important and powerful was, the premium and value area, so that we were shifting some of the folks from the inner core to the outer areas by pricing mechanisms, and then also by simplifying. Simplification and keeping it simple was really key. And I think we had a patchwork downtown of pricing, and we had merchants arguing, et cetera. So, and staff did a great job in implementing, communicating. The graphics was really terrific, et cetera. I can tell you, we didn't get a single complaint.
We're going to start off with Donald Shoup. He's the man of the hour, and he hardly needs an introduction in this context. If you know about parking, you know about Don, but I can't resist, so I have to say some things about him anyway here. He's a distinguished professor of urban planning at UCLA, I think still, maybe for another week or two, right here. So he's just now retiring. He's written and presented numerous publications, of course. Most famously is The High Cost of Free Parking, and really bringing parking economics into parking analysis here. He has a number of very cute nicknames, including the Parking Guru, Shoup Dog, and the Don.
Yes, I'd like to focus on one of the policies that was recommended, and that is called parking cash out. Many of you have heard of it, but some of you may not know exactly how it works, how it's been implemented. In 1992, the legislature passed a law called the Parking Cash Out Law that says if certain employers offer free parking to commuters, the employer has to offer commuters the option to choose the value of the free parking as a cash payment. That is, if I'm going to subsidize your parking, I have to say to you, if you don't take the parking, I'll offer you the cash. So it sounds like a very fair offer. It's very simple to say. You could have a parking subsidy, or if you don't park, you could have the cash value. It just says that you can't say to an employee, you could have free parking or nothing. And I think many people now realize that's really not fair, and it's not good for traffic congestion or air pollution, or now we know global warming. And so when a commuter does choose cash instead of a parking space, the firm saves on parking what it pays in cash because the law applies only to rented parking spaces. It only applies to commuters who park at a rented parking space. That is, the employer, as many employers do, they have to pay the building owner for parking permits, and they distribute them to employees. So if an employee doesn't take the parking, the employer saves money on not paying the building owner. And who is most deserving of that saving? If the employer is going to save on parking, should it be the employer who saves, or should it be the commuter who doesn't drive to work who saves? Well, with parking cash out, if a commuter says, well, no, I'll bike, or I'll carpool, or I'll walk, or I'll skateboard, it's the employee who doesn't drive to work who gets the benefit of it. So the company breaks even when the commuter takes cash instead of a parking space. It's simple, it's fair, and almost costless to the firm, and it significantly reduces solo driving to work. The Air Resources Board hired me to do a study of 1,700 employees who were offered the cash option, and of those employees, 17% of the solo drivers said, I'd rather have the cash. Most of them shifted to carpooling, or more than any other mode, so it reduced solo number of vehicle miles driven to work by about 12%. It doesn't have a huge effect. It's not like charging for parking. It's just saying that you can have the cash value if you don't take the parking. So it's the option to take cash that it makes commuters think about the alternatives to driving. So it especially benefited women in this study. It benefited women, minorities, and low-income commuters because all of them are more likely not to drive to work alone. So it's fair not just because it treats everybody equally. That is, it isn't more generous to bus riders or bicyclists than it is to drivers. It just says everybody has to be treated equally. But among the beneficiaries is disproportionately women and low-income people and minorities. Well, the surprising thing is that most employers have never heard of the parking cash out law. And one of its odd features is there's no penalty for not obeying it. That you could offer free parking or nothing, and there's no penalty if the employee says, well, I'd rather have the cash. That one, the employers have never heard of it, and second, there's no penalty for violating the law. Well, in 2010, the legislature passed a second backup law for the parking cash out law, saying that any air quality district or any local government can establish its own penalty for violating the law. And no air quality district or city that I know of has done that. And I'm urging you to do that here. I would say something, it would be simple like once the firm has been notified that it's in violation of the law, that if it continues to violate the law, it'll have to make back payments to the employees that it should have paid money to. That's not a real penalty. It's just saying you have to do what the law says you do. So the added advantage of parking cash out is the law requires it. And it's very odd that it's so little implemented. When I came to Oakland Airport yesterday, I used Lyft to get to the Berkeley campus, to the faculty club. And I always, with Lyft rides, you always sit in front and you talk to the driver. He worked at the Oakland Airport in the air cargo division for Delta Airlines. I said, well, where do you park? I always ask everybody that. And then I asked, how much, and he showed me his permit, and I said, well, how much does it cost? And he knew it was $90 a month. And I said, well, and he worked for Delta Airlines. So I asked him, well, are you offered any alternative if you took the bus or the new rail line that they've just spent, what, hundreds of millions of dollars building to extend BARC to the Oakland Airport? No, it's just a parking permit or nothing. So I think that, Valerie, the first thing I recommend to you is you call Delta Airlines Human Relations tomorrow and tell them there is a law saying you're supposed to offer parking cash out. So, and for the ARB study, it turns out that there were a lot of benefits of the firms that did participate, comply with the law. They said it was very easy. I had to interview all the employee commute experts, and I had a list of questions I asked them that the ARB wanted me to ask them. Is this difficult? And they all said it was simple. It's like changing the number of dependents on a W-2 form. And I asked one firm, is it difficult to operate a parking cash out program? And he looked at me as though I was the dumbest person on earth. He says, you either get a parking permit or $65 a month. It's as simple as that. Can't you understand? It is that simple, and it's fair. It treats low-income commuters as well as higher-income commuters. It treats transit riders as well as solo drivers. And the ARB made their own. The legislative analyst did a study of it, and they estimated it would reduce about 100,000 tons of CO2 a year. And I think most cities, especially in the Bay Area, are very self-congratulatory about how they're trying to combat climate change. Here's an easy way to do it, is to just treat everybody fairly. Well, that's about all I know, so I better stop. So I'll let the others have a chance to talk, and there's so much more to talk about today. Thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Deacon. She's a professor of city and regional planning and urban design at UC Berkeley and has been for quite some time. She's written extensively on transportation demand management and transportation policy. She chaired the Berkeley Transportation Commission and worked to draft the ballot measure that ultimately became the first transportation sales tax for Alameda County. She's testified on numerous occasions for the state legislature, the U.S. Congress, and parliamentary committees in Australia and the EU. Currently, she is editing a book on international experience with high-speed rail and is working on a project on implementation of global warming legislation. Is that correct, Betty?
Not global warming.
Global warming legislation? No? She will correct that. Thank you, Betty.
Against global warming, yeah, not promoting it. Don's given us a good overview of the problem of free parking. But one thing here in the Bay Area is we have a lot of parking that's not free. We charge a price for it. And there the challenge is, what's the right price? How do we get the prices right? And that's what I'd like to talk about a little bit. And I think there are, it's not a straightforward question in that we have not only the issue of what you need to cover costs, and cost recovery is part of that issue. But sometimes there's an issue of whether land value has actually been included in those calculations. A lot of times it hasn't been. And when you're only looking at operating costs, so you're looking at a marginal cost of providing parking, you get a very different number than if you look at the land rent that would be attributed to this in the private sector or in normal accounting practices, for that matter. And so in many cases, even when we're charging for parking, we're undercharging for parking because we're only charging that marginal cost of covering operations and maybe a little profit. There are some other issues, of course, that go along with that, and I think Terry and Kelly covered some of those, which is that we have parking users who have viewpoints on what they should pay for parking that sometimes are a pretty big voice with institutions. So employers, public or private, often hear from their parkers about what they need to do, and that's something that we have to take into consideration because we sometimes think of parking as an employee benefit, and the Congress has allowed that, has allowed parking to be treated as an employee benefit. And one, of course, complication that we have with parking cash out is that while parking is treated as an employee benefit, free parking isn't treated as an in-kind employee benefit. That is, the attribution of what the cost is not necessarily charged to people. So we end up with a very messy tax situation as well in this. But I want to make 3 points. One is that just about every study that's been done on pricing for parking has found that there are very low price elasticities for parking. Typically, they're in the minus 0.1 to minus 0.3 range. Now, minus 0.1 parking elasticity means that if you double the price of parking, you'd lose about 10% of your users. Okay, so at minus 0.3, you'd lose 30%. And that's the range. There are a few studies that have found higher elasticities. Doug Henscher did a study in Australia where he found a minus 0.57 elasticity, but what he was actually looking at was exactly the Berkeley project where you move people from one part of town to another part of town. So he's looking at the elasticity of getting parkers to just transfer to a somewhat cheaper parking space in the same walking distance or within walking distance of their destination. And then Don Shoup and his former student, now professor at Cal Poly, Rick Wilson, did some studies years ago where they looked at parking elasticities where people were going from free to charge. And when you go from free to charge, people behave rather differently from when you go from any charge to a different charge. So there you often find that there's a big difference. And I think that's because giving some price signal knocks people aside of the head and makes them think a little bit about what their choices are. And a lot of people discover they do have choices and that those choices are pretty good. And so you get more movement. So you get higher elasticities in those kinds of situations. Now, what are the implications of a low parking price elasticity? It means that just raising parking prices isn't going to magically cure your traffic problems or magically get people to switch to transit or magically get people to do anything really very differently. What it does mean is it can generate quite a bit of revenue for you, because you won't lose so many parkers by raising your price, and you will get the revenue. And by spending that revenue in an intelligent way, that's the way that you can begin to improve transit service, improve carpooling programs, improve the technology you're using on your parking systems, do a lot of different things that will be very, very effective in making people behave differently. I think you need to think about not just the price and getting the price right, but also to be thinking about getting the expenditures right too. So you're thinking about what you can do with the revenues that will make your system operate better. And in a day and age where we really need to think about reducing vehicle miles of travel, because we do need to reduce global warming if we want our children and grandchildren to have a happy world, then thinking about getting that price right is really important. Now, the second thing I want to mention is that there's kind of parking that sometimes we don't like to talk about, and that's resident parking, on-street resident parking. Now, in almost every city in California, the resident on-street parking is actually public-owned parking. It's city street parking. And in lots and lots of places, it's free to residents, or even when they're resident permits, the resident permits are really cheap. Now, there are different varieties of resident permit parking, but a common one in California is to say we'll charge a small fee per year for residents to park their cars on the street, and then we'll let others who don't have a permit park for 2 hours for free. So essentially, we've created another supply of free parking. And what we find when we study what happens in resident permit parking zones is around major institutions, when you've got resident permit parking with 2-hour free parking, you get a certain number of people who will use their coffee breaks and their lunch break to walk out and feed and move their car or wipe the chalk marks off the tire and park all day for free. And they kind of look at this as a libertarian action on their part. They're beating the system. We don't have to do it this way. There are some other strategies that have been used in other cities. If you go to Boston or Cambridge, which are cities that places like San Francisco and Berkeley like to compare themselves to, you find that resident permit parking is only for residents. They pay a much higher fee for that parking space because it's a valued resource that they're using up, and there's a lot of metered parking. And so non-residents park at meters. They don't park for free in the resident permit parking because they would get a very big fine if they did that. The other strategy that I think is becoming more and more possible is pay by sell. So if you wanted to actually sell some of your resident permit parking to the residents, you can do so. And that's actually not a bad strategy, in that having empty residential streets might not be the best use of your residential street space. But why make it free? Why not charge people $1 an hour for parking there, let them pay by sell? Off they go. They've paid theirs. Their license number shows up on the list, and they're done. And we're beginning to see some of this happen in the European Union, in France and in the Netherlands. We're seeing this kind of pay by sell for resident parking where there aren't meters on the streets. So that's a possibility. So I'm going to stop there and say that, again, price elasticities are low. That means you can raise a lot of revenue if you spend the revenue on things that will actually make a difference in your city. You can have parking, and you can have other alternatives get better. And secondly, if you don't think about resident permit parking, you may be undercutting some of your strategies, but there are ways of improving that sort of strategy by implementing a price. Thanks.
So next we're going to hear from Todd Littman. He's founder and executive director of the Victoria Transport Policy Institute, which is an independent research organization dedicated to developing innovative solutions to transport problems. His work helps expand the range of impacts and options considered in parking pricing, improving evaluation methods. I know a lot of people who go to the VTPI site to find case studies and good information on parking policies. His research is used worldwide in transport planning and policy analysis.
Okay, so I want to find out a little bit about you in the audience. Tell me, raise your hand if you aspire to make the world a better place. Okay, put your hand down. Raise your hand if you work with a combination of quantitative and qualitative analysis. Okay, great. Raise your hand if you are frequently frustrated that people don't see the brilliance of your innovations. Okay, I'm glad to see I am in a room full of planners. You are members of my tribe, a wonderful group of people, and I am very happy to be here because this is what's going on in San Francisco. I think is an example of some of the best, most audacious planning research going on anywhere in the world. It's on par with really world-class thinking about a problem and then testing, being willing to do pilot projects and approaching it as a research. So getting before and after data and all this great stuff. So well done. You should be really proud. Everybody who is involved. Is it easy? No. Okay, so let me start off. One of the things that I like about your analysis is that the first thing that it talks about is the goals. And the most fundamental principle of good planning, take notes here, this is going to be on the test, is that individual short-term decisions should be consistent and support your long-term strategic goals. So that is the fundamental principle, and I do see that reflected here. You're starting off saying our goals include things like climate change emission reductions. I think it could include more. It could also it should very clearly say congestion reduction, traffic accident reductions, which is a huge benefit of efficient transportation pricing that unfortunately gets overlooked, and social equity. And Don did point out that some of these strategies actually help poor people or poor and people that are disadvantaged in various ways, because they're already using parking less. They either don't own a car or they're driving less than their more affluent friends. So there are some very good things that we can do with more efficient parking. The challenge that we have really is about communication. Most people outside of this room have never purchased a parking space as a separate item. Parking is included with the house that they buy. It's paid for through their taxes. It's included as an employee benefit. It's paid for when they buy an apple in the store. A little part of that price of that apple is paying for the parking at the store. Most people don't know what a parking space costs. What does a parking space cost? Okay, in an urban area, a surface parking space, just for consistency, I like to annualize these numbers. So I say an urban parking space is probably worth a surface space is between $500 and $1,500 a year, annualized cost if you include the capital, the value of the land, and the operating expenses. And structured parking is twice that, and sometimes 3 times as much that if it's underground. Okay, that means that most vehicles let's put it this way, most structured parking spaces are worth more than the vehicle that occupies them. And because there are between 2 and 6 parking spaces per vehicle, almost no vehicles are worth more than the total sum of the parking spaces that are provided for it. That is the message that I think we need to communicate. But the point I want to make is it actually really is easy to communicate the huge cost of these parking spaces if we compare them with the cost of the car. And we point out that it is actually more rational to give away cars but charge for parking than it is to charge for the car and give away the parking spaces. Okay, and I think that but the challenge that the way we need to phrase this, we need to turn this into a positive statement. By charging directly for parking, rather than having the cost of parking borne indirectly, we are offering consumers a new opportunity to save money that doesn't currently exist. The best example is unbundling parking. Are you better off paying $1,000 a month for an apartment with a parking space, or $900 a month for an apartment with $100 a month for each parking space that you actually use? Which makes people better off? The unbundled parking, because it gives you an opportunity to save money that doesn't exist if the parking is bundled. And we can say the same thing about parking cash out. It's a new opportunity to save money. We need to turn these into positive statements so people are out there in front of City Hall protesting, charge me for parking. Okay. It is inefficient and unfair to provide abundant free parking, unpriced parking, because not only does it lead to inefficient use of the parking spaces, parking resources, but it also leverages this very significant increase in automobile ownership and use. Now, Betty was saying parking has a low price elasticity, and yes, that's kind of true. But the way I phrase it is typically going from unpriced parking to cost recovery parking reduces demand for that parking by 10 to 30%, and even more if you're in a location that has really good alternatives. So, for example, if a developer goes from giving away a parking space with each unit to charging the cost recovery for structured parking, that would be something like $100 to $200 a month, and puts a car share vehicle in that building or on the street nearby, and those buildings are located in walkable and transit-rich areas, we find that demand for parking goes from typically 1.2 or so parking spaces per unit to somewhere between 0.2 and 0.5. So the new developments in affluent cities like Vancouver, if they're located in downtown, people only demand about 0.5 parking spaces per unit. And these are affluent, very high-end units. Okay? So one way to put this is 20%, somewhere around 20% of our traffic congestion problems and our traffic accident problems and our air pollution problems and our energy problems and all of these problems are the result from inefficient pricing of parking. 20%. And there is a whole bunch of optimistic and politically almost impossible enthusiasm for congestion pricing in North America. So a bunch of economists love congestion pricing and nobody else does. And efficient pricing of parking is the second best way to achieve your congestion reduction that you would achieve by charging efficient for roads. Okay, so here's another way to put it. Let me ask you this. How much water can you put in a 1-gallon jar? 1 gallon. What happens if you try and put 2 gallons in a 1-gallon jar? Exactly, it spills over. A city is by definition a place where space is limited, space is constrained. What happens when you try and put, let's say, 500 vehicles per 1,000 population into a city that the road and the parking spaces can only accommodate 300? Yeah, you call it traffic congestion and parking problems and all kinds of other bad things. A city has limited space. A car, when you take into account typical road space and the space required for 2 to 6 parking spaces, a typical car uses more land than the average urban resident uses for their house. So when we talk about population density, optimum population density, it's at least as important, and I do a lot of research on this. You might have heard of this study I did with the London School of Economics that came out a couple months ago, estimated the cost of sprawl and the optimal level of density for North American cities and worldwide cities. And one of my key findings from that study was that when we talk about optimal densities, it really is as important or more important to talk about the optimal density for vehicles as the optimal density for people. What is the practical mechanism to control the population growth of cars? Parking management. Okay, so efficiency requires a new paradigm since most North Americans are accustomed to and expect as a right unpriced roads and parking. So we need to redefine the problem. We need to be able to say the average person is going to be better off with efficient parking management. And so we need to redefine parking problem. Usually when you're in at a cocktail party and you say, oh, I'm an expert on parking management, and suddenly people tell you their problem with inadequate parking supply, right? Okay? We need to redefine the problem that it is equally, yes, that's a problem when there isn't enough parking, but it is equally severe, inefficient, and inequitable if you have too much parking. Similarly, people will complain about paying for parking. They think parking should be free. We need to educate them, be a little bit that no parking is ever free. It's either paying directly or indirectly. And that underpricing parking is as much a problem. It is just as economically inefficient and unfair as overpricing parking. There's a rich vocabulary for saying we're overpricing something. We're being gypped, we're being gouged, we're being taken. There is no vocabulary for talking about underpricing, and yet it is equally a severe problem. Okay, so I'm going to have to wrap up here, but okay, so what is the optimal supply? This is one of the questions that was on the list. What is the optimal supply? That is the amount that consumers are willing to pay given good travel and parking options. So we can actually use this economic theory, and Don and a bunch of other people have been working to try and apply basic market theory, and all it says is, sure, parking demand should be defined at relative to the cost of providing that parking space. And if consumers are willing to pay the full cost of that parking space, they should get it. But it does turn out that demand, the actual demand, when you price it, goes down 20% or more compared with what we currently experience. That is actually very good news. Okay, the last point I want to make, building on a comment Betty had about how important it's going to be to start applying this in residential areas, not just in the commercial areas. I want to point out one additional detail that often gets overlooked. Our zoning codes require off-street parking. Every time we build an off-street parking space, we need to put a driveway in. Every driveway displaces one on-street parking space. So, like on my street, there are some houses. I live on one of these old neighborhoods, lots of old houses that don't have garages, but every one of the houses that does have a driveway, a garage, the garage is not used for the car. The garage is used for storage. The car parks in the driveway, and that driveway is taking up one on-street parking space that is actually more publicly efficient because the on-street space can be shared with other people on the street. It's a public resource. Where the driveway with one off-street space, which is what you end up with, there is no net increase in the supply of parking. The primary mechanism that we use to provide parking space gives you almost zero increase in parking supply for single-family housing in urban areas. Almost everybody would be better off if we, instead of having zoning codes that require generous amounts of off-street parking, instead, we simply manage the on-street parking spaces more efficiently in residential areas. So I'm going to have to end there, but I'm hoping that this will lead to more discussion. Great, thanks.
And our fourth expert here is Mia Kang. Mia comes from a somewhat different perspective. She's a developer, and I love the fact that she's actually involved in getting affordable housing produced in the real world. So rather than just being academic, which is wonderful here, she actually gets some housing out there. She wrestles with the real world politics of parking and of development, which is a wonderful perspective to bring. She is a president and co-founder of, how do you pronounce it, Domus Development, and she has led an award-winning infill development company that specializes in socially responsible and environmentally conscious building. She was awarded the 2014 Locus Leadership Award for Smart Growth America from Smart Growth America, and she received the Governor's Environmental and Economic Leadership Award, among many other awards. She serves on a long list of prominent boards and councils. I'm not going to name them all here because it's long. And she was recently appointed by Governor Jerry Brown to serve on the Capital Area Committee. And I know she's very involved in proposing legislation and trying to come up with sensible solutions to our parking problems. So, Mia.
Good afternoon. So I guess I'm a little bit on the outside because I'm not a planner, but every day I engage with planners. And I think about parking every day because I build housing, and I build affordable housing, and I'm a statewide developer of affordable housing in infill areas around transit. I build for the workforce, families, special needs, and seniors. And we also build mixed use projects where we have retail on the ground floor and housing above. We take on brownfields, we clean them up, we reinvigorate cities, and we continue redevelopment efforts, even though we have no redevelopment agencies left in the state. But we're doing all these things. Why? Because we know we're really at that sort of pinnacle in terms of lack of affordability, lack of housing in the Bay Area, lack of housing in California, because it seems as though we as Californians, and I think everywhere in the U.S., we actually care more about free parking for cars than housing for people. And that pretty much trickles down throughout almost everything. And from a developer perspective, when I open up a zoning book, when I look at my perspective side, I got to see what do I have to grapple with? What do I have to change? So my motto is I've never met a plan I haven't had to change. Because no matter what, those endless hours of plans that y'all make, they don't all work. And there isn't flexibility because we think in a way a one size fits all, right? So we think, okay, it's additive. We're building this many units of housing, therefore we need to have 1.2, 2.6, however many parking spaces per unit, and we're just going to say that's the standard. So regardless of where you're building it, that's our standard. And that really is challenging because not all of our sites are equal. And if we really want this focus on walkable communities, neighborhoods that have character, where we actually want to prioritize the pedestrian or prioritize the people, why do we force so much parking down everyone's throats? And so it's frustrating. Every single project I've ever had to build in California, the number one thing I've had to do universally for every single project is reduce the parking requirements because they don't fit. And often they're so excessive that you can't make a development work. And so the irony sometimes is cities will say, well, we've rezoned it. You've got extra height. You can do 120 feet. You can have densities that are, over 100 per acre. But oh, by the way, you got to park 2 cars per unit. You can't make that work. And you've got to look at cost of construction and cost of return. Or what are you building? Are you building affordable housing? That means gap, right? So the world of subsidy, if we all know what that means, we don't have a lot of subsidy anymore. So one of the ways to reduce the gap is to reduce the amount of parking. And it starts to make sense, right? Because transit-oriented developments, we've got Lyft, we've got car sharing, we've got Uber, we've got different ways, different mode shares of how people are getting from point A to point B. Yet we don't recognize that in our codes today. We don't have that flexibility. Why? This is why. It's kind of what people were saying here, what Todd was saying here, because constituents control the dialogue in so many ways, right? Those neighbors that don't park in their garages because they park on the street say, no way, I don't want that new development in my neighborhood because I can't find anywhere to park. Why? Because no one parks in their garage. They all park on the street. And everybody believes that that parking space in front of their house is their own parking space for their designated guests, for their designated cars, for their 6 cars that don't fit in their garage, whatever it might be. And so what do we say instead? New developer coming in, you must fix all of the evils of the past. So therefore, we're going to force you, because there's so much NIMBYism around the development, everyone's going to come out screaming about traffic congestion, parking congestion. What are we going to do? More off-street parking. That's the solution. Not only residential parking, but let's throw down some guest parking too. I know if you're doing mixed use, you might as well do mixed use parking as well, because we don't know anything about shared parking, right? You gotta handle it all, because what's the worst case scenario? Spillover parking. That's it. That's everybody's biggest fear, is spillover parking. And you're thinking, I keep thinking, so what? You want people walking. I go to towns. I did a project in the city of Vallejo when it was bankrupt, when downtown was a ghost town, where vacancy rates in downtown Vallejo were 70% for businesses. And it's free parking downtown. You could park overnight. So my building was it was an old historic building. It was a Masonic temple from 1917. It also included the original City Hall from 1874. And I said, I can put 29 units in this building. By the way, it was foreclosed for 3 years. Vallejo was the first city in California to claim bankruptcy. And I said, I will bring in artist live-work housing in your designated arts district, where there is no housing now. And we will bring people. into these old buildings, and we will put them on the National Registry of Historic Places, and I will renovate them beautifully and historically. They said, well, what about the parking? You need 45 parking spaces for 29 units. And I looked across the street, and there's a 3,000 parking space surface lot that's owned by the city. That's all free. And I said, can't they park there? There's no one parking there right now. They said, no. That's the city parking, and that's for the public. Your residents can't park there. And I'm like, you have no businesses downtown. You really need people down here. Why can't people park on the street? Can't you just give them a permit? They can pay $25 a year, get a residential permit. Oh, we don't have any residential permit standards. Oh, we're going to work on some big traffic parking plan, but it hasn't happened yet, so we just can't let you park there. So go find 45 parking spaces somewhere in downtown Vallejo, and then you can build your building. Or just figure out how to get it into your building. In other words, lift up a 100-year-old building and put parking below it, because that's what they cared about. And so then neighbors would come out and start screaming, we're having a parking problem. I said, really? You want a parking problem in your downtown? Like when you're in San Francisco, when you want to be in that it place, that best restaurant, you're going to circle 3 or 4 times to find a parking space because you know you want to be there like everyone else. Well, this is a town where you can just pull right up to wherever you're going. And their whole thing is they wanted to be so close to the front door where no one would panhandle them. And that was the reason why we needed to build more off-site parking. So I managed to get that project approved, 0 parking. As a result, downtown is starting to flourish. New businesses have opened. Our residents are contributing to the area. There's more arts and entertainment going on. Why? Because we didn't put more parking downtown. We actually let the existing parking service, the parking for the area. So, the reality, though, is we need to do better. I honestly think that one of the challenges in the Bay Area, as well as other places, is the missing middle. That's what we're calling it. We're calling it that sort of housing group that, so what you see in San Francisco is affordable housing, very deeply affordable, or super high-end luxury housing. So if you've got $2 million to throw down at a pied-à-terre and you live somewhere in France, you can go and do that in San Francisco. You may not live there, except for a week a year, but that's your housing choices. And it's very hard to get in between, right? So where's in between? In between means the burbs, Tracy, California, or Brentwood, or places that, unfortunately, nothing against those cities, I like those cities, but it's just, you have these commuting patterns, right? And so how are we going to start utilizing our existing areas? Well, one of my theories is eliminate parking requirements. Allow people, which the trend now is we're moving away from all individual ownership of cars because we have other options. We've got great options like transit. We've got great options like our 2 feet that will walk us from place to place. We have great options like car sharing and different mode shares and bicycling, right? So guess what? Not everyone owns a car anymore. In San Francisco, the car ownership rate per capita is 0.54, and 0.59. And in Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles, the city of sprawl, the city of 11 million people, the per capita car ownership rate is 0.54. That's less than a car per person in the city of Los Angeles. So we're already seeing a shift, yet we still have all of our cities demanding off-street parking requirements, forcing developers to either fight the fight and have to go to planning commission, and you're going to tell all your community members that you want a reduction in parking. And what are they going to all say? No, not in my neighborhood, because my neighborhoods are crowded. So what do? They say, okay, force more cars in. We're going to park more cars in those developments. And then what happens? You now have more cars on the street. You now have more congestion. You now have bad air. You now have problems that are multiplied. And yet that seems to be the one-size solution that local government loves to be able to say we should do. Why? Because for the momentary time, it quiets your NIMBYs, right? NIMBYs are satisfied because they believe the new development is going to build so much excess parking that maybe they'll even have more parking for more of their friends to come visit. So, we've got it. I agree. I'm not the academic. I'm just the pragmatic. I'm the person who has to fight those fights down on the ground and try to make things happen. So if people are so moved, I have to tell you about a bill we're working on. It's called AB 744. And I have to admit, this is my 3rd time at statewide parking reform. Twice I failed because of the League of Cities. I'll say it now. They hate me talking about parking because it's all about local control. Nobody wants the state to tell them what to do. Every jurisdiction's different. Therefore, every jurisdiction has the right to deny parking variances, has the right to have excessive parking requirements because it's their city and it's their control. But when you look at this regional aspect, or you look at a state aspect, or we're looking at housing affordability crisis all over the state, we've got to look at it as a statewide issue. And we have to look at transportation as a statewide issue. And if we're making these kinds of investments in transportation, and we're caring about the health of our people and the health of our environment, we have to couple that with the requirement that the state needs to intervene in the situation of parking. And so this bill, AB 744, which is being authored by Assemblymember Chow, it's going to the floor vote for the Assembly on Thursday. I even have support letters if anyone wants to sign them. But what it will do is it will look at eliminating minimum requirements for parking for 100% affordable housing within a half mile of transit. If you are building inclusionary housing under SB 1818 and you're doing a small percentage of affordability and the rest market rate, your parking ratio could go down to 0.5 per bedroom. And if you're building special needs housing or senior housing that's 100% affordable, regardless of where it is, eliminate parking requirements. And let me just tell you, I build affordable housing statewide. Let me just give you some averages. For special needs housing that we've built statewide, on average, the average median income of our residents are $11,600 a year. $11,600 a year. Many developments, I just got a project approved in the city of Stockton for mentally ill and chronically homeless. The city demanded 2 parking spaces per unit. It took me 8 months to negotiate, to tell them that my residents will not be driving. Car ownership, cost of cars, $10,000 a year on average, insurance, you name it. So your average low-income person, you know, if they have a choice, they would love not to own a car and instead have more income for themselves and for their families. For senior housing, for a regular sort of tax credit project, you're looking at about $21,000 per person on average. And for a family project, believe it or not, in some, you know, sort of general ballpark, statewide again, we're looking at about $23,000 a year for a family of 3. So think about what $10,000 a year could do for a family earning $23,000 a year, and how much that could free up income, household income, to invest in things that are discretionary, like your children's extracurricular activities, like food on the table, like things that you can do for your own for your own well-being. And yet, we, in many cases, force individuals to drive because we set up the dynamic. So there's free parking everywhere. It's so hard to walk from point A to point B that you have to drive. And yet that we need to shift that dynamic so that we can move forward into, I think, a vision of what we see as a sustainable California under AB 32 and SB 375. And I think the great work that MTC and ABAG is doing is sort of projecting a vision of how we can move there. And I think if we eliminate minimum parking requirements, we can start to move that needle. We could start to build more housing for people rather than free parking for cars. Thank you.
What can we do, what can local jurisdictions do to increase community support for changes in parking policies?
You'll never get people to say that they want to pay for parking, including me. That nobody wants to pay for parking, and you'll never convince them it's a good idea. But what you can do is convince people they want to charge for parking. I call this a situation in which you offer a neighborhood to put in parking meters and spend the revenue on the metered streets, a parking benefit district. And some cities are doing that. You don't say, we're going to put in parking meters and the money will disappear into the general fund. If it's a package, a combination of parking meters and the special revenue that goes to pay for repairing your sidewalks and putting in historic street furniture or removing graffiti and everything the neighborhood wants. That is how you get people to say, well, let's do it, or let's run them. The first one in California was in Old Pasadena. Some of you may have been down there. Tourists go there all the time. It used to be Skid Row. Nobody would go there. They were wonderful buildings in terrible condition, like we have in many cities. And close to this building, I was just looking out at lunch. There's a beautiful building just across the street that is in terrible condition. So the city wanted to put in parking meters, and the merchant said, no way, it'll chase away the few customers we have. And they argued for a couple of years, and then the city said, all right, if we put in the parking meters, all the revenue will pay for public services on your street. And the merchants and landowners said, well, that's different. Why didn't you tell us that? Let's run the meters till midnight. Let's run them on Sunday. That's how you get people to be interested in priced parking. Not because anybody wants to pay, but because somebody wants to charge. And I think the people who are going to pay are usually people who don't live on the metered street. So they have no stake, they have no political representation in the world. The only people who have any political representation are the property owners and the residents and the merchants. So I think that you can't talk about pricing parking without thinking what happens to the revenue. And I think that if you very flamboyantly commit the revenue to pay for public services on the metered streets, you'll get a lot more action. Another thing that's allowed by new technology is to give residents of your city a discount at the parking meters. That Miami Beach already does this, that the park in the South Beach area, the parking meter is $1.75 an hour, but if your car is registered in Miami Beach, you pay $1 an hour. I think Monterey, in their parking structures, the first 2 hours is free to residents. And the non-residents don't know that the residents are paying more than they are. That I think that's another way to say we ought to charge for parking. It's like the Monty Python said that the way to solve Britain's economics problem was to tax foreigners living abroad. And I think that parking meters are the way to do this.
That I don't think we should overreact to the few people who come forward and say, geez, I don't want to pay anything for parking or it costs too much. We have done studies now in the city of Berkeley with my graduate students for several years, and we did this partly as part of the Go Berkeley study as well, where we actually intercepted people who had just parked and said, what did you just pay for the parking space? And they said, I don't know, a couple dollars. I just put it in until the meter was full, dropped coins in, or I used my credit card and pressed the max. And they had no idea. The majority of people did not know what they just paid. We then told them what the rates were, and they asked them whether they thought they were high or not high. And about 25% said, gee, that's higher than I thought it was. And 75% said, that's fine. And another 20, and of whom about 25% said, that's actually pretty cheap. So what we ended up with when we actually did intercept surveys with hundreds of people in Berkeley was that the majority of people thought the parking rates were fine or actually inexpensive, and only a small number were going to complain. So if you listen to the complainers too much, you're not listening to the majority of the people, and that's something to really think about. Again, spending that money on things that actually benefits people in the town makes a huge difference. Complete streets policies are something that could use more money in California. And so for the city of Oakland, my graduate students went out this fall and did surveys in the Temescal neighborhood, where the merchants were very nervous about the idea that if you did a complete streets project on Telegraph Avenue, we would end up in a situation where their customers would be driven away. Well, what we found is, not surprisingly actually to us, the majority of customers were actually residents of the area. There were more people who were walking to the area and than were driving to the area. There were actually more people taking transit to the area than were driving to the area. And that the people who were biking and walking because they went more frequently, and using transit because they went more frequently to the area than the people who were driving, actually spent more money. So if you looked at how much money they reported spending in the last week or the last month, they spent more money, the walkers, the bikers, and the transit users, the residents of the area, in that area, than the people who are driving. So privileging the parking space over all those people who are walking or biking or taking transit is not necessarily getting you any more money. It might be getting you less money in some places. Now, we created a survey that Oakland, I think, is planning to use in other neighborhoods, so we'll see this proliferating, I hope, and we'll get more and more data on this. But I would strongly urge every city representative here to really think about studying who is actually driving in your community and how much they're driving and what the overall balance is. When we've worked with merchants in Berkeley and Oakland and in San Francisco over the years, one of the things we routinely find is people say, oh heavens, if we mess up the parking, nobody will come to our shops. And then we do studies of who's coming to their shops, and it is not in fact the people who are driving. They're not the ones who are coming frequently. They're not the ones who are spending the majority of the money. It's all the people in the resident areas who are coming there and doing this. And Mia made a really good point. If a place is vibrant, people will look a little bit for parking. They don't need to pull up in front of the shop they're going to. They will park a couple of blocks away, or they'll go around the block once if they need to. So you don't need to get quite so incensed about losing a few parking spaces. And in fact, we think we need to do some studies of things like parklets, because my guess is that parklets actually generate more business than the parking space generated. And we're hoping to do a study that's a university-city partnership on Solano Avenue with a parklet that's being proposed, and test that out a little bit. So we'll be looking at that in the next few months. But don't overreact to the idea that the parking is so critical. Spend your money on things that really make your city a better place, a more livable city, and I think you'll end up finding that charging for parking, listening to everybody in the community and not just to a few vocal people, and really thinking about having something that will make your city a better place will get you a lot farther.
Who saw the last episode of Mad Men? Okay. Where did Don Draper end up?
Ended up California.
That's right, in Esalen, meditating just south of here in Big Sur. It's time, as I frequently say in wearing my role as a planner, it's time to fire a few of the engineers and hire more marketing professionals. Don Draper must be ready. He's probably retired here in California, and he's ready for a last consulting contract. We need to redefine the issues to make affordable infill housing with reduced parking requirements and paying directly rather than indirectly for parking seem attractive. The good news is we really do have the truth on our side. It really is more economically efficient and more equitable to manage parking efficiently. And you can look at it from many different perspectives, and you come to that same conclusion. If you're looking at very strategic objectives, so you're a planner thinking about reducing traffic congestion or air pollution, or building more affordable housing, or you're just thinking of the fairness to low-income people, or there's all kinds of different perspectives. You reach the same conclusion. We could be doing much better by applying the very strategies that we're talking about here. But it's up to us to reframe the questions, to apply a new paradigm. We are beginning to get some good stories, and Don here with Pasadena. How long ago? How many years have you been telling the story about Pasadena now?
Oh, about 1938.
Okay. Okay. Well, we have that story, and I tell it frequently, and now we're beginning to have Vallejo, and we've got a few good case studies that some of the nonprofit organizations are collecting. So we actually do have some positive stories about the effectiveness and the benefits that result. How well are we doing bringing this information to the general public? Yeah.
Well, I have another story related to Valerie's question. How do you make parking charges for parking popular? This happened in Ventura, California. It also happens in Galveston, Texas. At the multi-space parking kiosks that maybe govern the parking spaces on the block, they have to communicate with City Hall to validate credit cards and to change prices remotely. And in Ventura and Galveston, they use Wi-Fi to do this. Then it turned out there's a low power transmitter in the meter, and then a router up on the telephone pole that's connected to the power supply. And the city engineer realized that there was a lot of excess capacity in the router because there are not that many credit cards being validated. So they opened up the Wi-Fi to everybody on the metered street. So you associate, if you have meters on your street, you have free Wi-Fi on your street. Mm-hmm. And the restaurants and the coffee shops canceled their subscription to Wi-Fi because whenever their customers open their laptop, it says Wi-Fi courtesy of the parking service. And I think if around the world, not just in California, around the world, the parking meters became identified with free Wi-Fi, you'd see a lot of people saying, I see what you mean. I want to have meters in my neighborhood.
Sure.
And you know, I often focus on what's good for me. Yeah, I'm not talking in his terms about what's good for society. I'm talking about what's good for me. And I think that if you can associate parking charges with free Wi-Fi, you'll see a lot more people who can see the wisdom of charging for parking.
I was going to kind of go down the pilot road because I think pilots are great. Because in many respects, you don't need consensus. You don't necessarily, well, maybe you do, but I mean, you've got to experiment a little. And I think a lot of the development that I do also, it's a little bit of trial and error because, you know, you're not necessarily creating the same widget to fit in every single bucket. You're creating something a little different. And I think the reality, though, is it's so important that our local leaders lead. You're elected to lead, right? Because we believe in our leaders. And in many respects, I think we have to trust them to lead. And so many times, everybody's a quarterback. Everyone's going to sit there, armchair quarterback, and tell everyone why you can't do something and how it's never perfect, right? So it's that whole enemy of good is trying to be perfect, right? So no one wants to do anything unless it's absolutely vetted and absolutely perfect. And I think the reality is that's really damaging because then status quo becomes your only solution. So I tell everyone status quo is not the solution. If we're frustrated with the situations now, yet they're too hard to change, just keeping everything the same, even though safely, you know, you can stay in office because you didn't mess things up, you didn't make it any worse, but the reality is you didn't make it any better either. So I think we have to work on changing the paradigm, I believe, from the marketing perspective, but then just going out and doing things. Because once we do them, then you can point to them, and people can say it's not as bad as I thought. And I can tell you, almost every one of my NIMBYs has become a supporter after the building was done. And then they're like, it's not as bad, it's not as big. Wow, I really didn't think you were going to build that. And so much of this is we've got to take that first step. And even though not everyone is 100% behind you in that decision, you have enough academic background to do it. You have enough, I think, sort of like regional support, like with MTC and ABAG, to do the right things and to start to pilot those in your communities, especially the ones that are staunchly opposed to any kind of change. And we have that happening because it's the whole, you know, the enemy that I know now is a lot easier to understand than the enemy that I don't know. And so it's the fear of change that I think drives this absolute fear that whatever you're going to do is going to be worse than what it is now. And they don't necessarily jump to the conclusion that it's going to be better. And so whether it's framing or marketing or whatever it is, or just get out there and do it, I think it's really important to try to experiment. And I go back to, I was on a panel in November with Gil Penalosa, who was a former, I think, parks director for the city of Bogota, and Todd and I were exchanging comments about Gil. And he worked with the city of New York to do some of the really transformational things in New York, like, for example, shutting down Times Square to cars and letting it go back to people. And when he was brought in to talk to the city planners, they were all like, "Oh my God, what are you trying to do? You're going to shut down streets to cars?" And it was really daunting for them to think about how are they going to do something so different. Like Gil has this thing called Cyclavilla, where they shut down streets for bicycles, and they did that in New York City. And it was incredible. Neighbors came out and met each other. Streets were overwhelmingly fun, festive places that were regained by families and children. And no one thought it could be possible in New York City, but it was because it was a pilot. And pilots were allowed. Their codes allowed pilots. So that planning director, all they needed was their signature to say that we are going to experiment with this pilot. And for that, it ushered a whole sea change of mentality in that city as to what could be possible and to regain some of those public spaces and to bring them back to the public. And I think as we move forward in this arena of reforming parking, looking at ways we're going to change how we move around, I think we all have to take a few lessons from New York City and do a few pilots, because I bet it's within everyone's jurisdiction to do a pilot, however small or however large. But I think starting somewhere will propel forward motion.
I'd like to do one more round and ask people, like, okay, so do you have a favorite regional policy that you think MTC ought to be considering, if you haven't already said, or if you have said? Don, you already mentioned one, the parking cash out, but a favorite regional policy that you think we really ought to consider pursuing?
Donald, one note about parking cash out, that every city can pass its own penalty for violating the parking cash out law, but the air quality district can do it. And it would save a lot of effort if the air quality district did the simple thing of saying that there will be a penalty for violating this law. Because it does, all the studies showed for the ARB showed that it does reduce air pollution. And of course it reduces traffic congestion and carbon emissions now. So I think it would be much simpler to do it at the regional level than to do it at the city level, although cities can do it. And I think it could be quite simple. It's a lot easier to establish a penalty for violating an existing law than it is to pass a new law for a new policy. The law has already been passed. It's not new. You don't have to do any heavy lifting about the policy. All you have to do is have the simple solution of a penalty for violating the law. And I think that it's hard for people to say, I do want to continue offering my employees free parking or nothing. I mean, if you oppose that law, you'll have to do some very fancy footwork to make it sound good in a public meeting, to say that, no, we shouldn't have a penalty for violating this law. And I think that it's not an imposition on anybody. I think that when it comes to parking, I'm pro-choice.
I think it would be really helpful if MTC would work on parking technologies that would make it easier to have variable pricing and flexibility in pricing and easier, cheaper enforcement of pricing, et cetera, that could be applied in a lot of different ways. Because right now that's a problem for a lot of cities, and something where I think a regional approach to really pushing for better technology and more consistent technology could help. We've had examples that I know of. Mike Evanhoff was just telling me about equipment that cost, I think you said $13,000, Mike, and then broke down in 3 years and required thousands of additional dollars spent. And I know another case where we had equipment that was purchased where the software wasn't up to security standards and therefore couldn't be used in the applications people intended, so that we couldn't use certain kinds of pricing strategies and so on. So we really could use some help, I think, there. And asking individual cities to do those kinds of studies wastes a lot of money, costs a lot of money. It results in a lot of duplication. So that's something where the region could push us forward.
All the previous plus, I think MTC could help with implementation by providing the tools and the information needed at the point that a decision gets made. So for example, as you know, but maybe other people in this room don't, City of Seattle, or maybe it's Puget Sound Regional Council, developed the right size parking calculator. Terrific device that allows a developer to identify the right amount of parking. And similarly, I suspect that there are fact sheets, brochures, websites, calculators, all kinds of things that we could produce and that are understandable to the general public, that focus on the benefits the direct benefits to various stakeholders of implementing these strategies. I think we're failing in terms of communication and implementation.
I want to thank all the panelists, or the experts, if we could all join in and thank them.